Accompong is a famous town in Jamaica where the legendary Maroons defeated the British in 1738. It gets its name from the famous Maroon general, Prince Accompong. He was one of the great heroes of the Maroon Wars. Along with his family, he freed many enslaved people and created a black sovereign republic that still exists to this day. Accompong is the second son of Prince Naquan, making him the younger brother of Kojo and the older brother of Johnny and Queen Nanny of the Maroons. Like his brother Kojo, he was born in the great Negro town, Jamaica, between 1659 and 1670, and raised in an Akan culture. His name Accompong is the Jamaican pronunciation of the Akan name for God, Nyankopong, meaning the Great One. Yet still some say it is a corruption of Achiampong, another Akan name which means destined for greatness, but also one who gives birth to a king. Accompong was indeed born for greatness. Accompong was raised in a traditional Akan community. However, there were elements of Taino, Moorish, Ibo, and Congo cultures around him. The Akan, or Coromantes, were more numerous in Jamaica. Thus, the culture of the Maroons is predominantly Akan. Accompong's native tongue was Twi, but as he got older, he spoke a pidgin language known as Coromante, which is predominantly Twi with elements of Spanish, Arawak, Bantu, and Kikongo languages. Eventually, he would learn some English, but was never really fluent. He was a tall, very dark, and well-built man. He was portrayed as being taller than Kojo, making him around 6'1" or taller. He may have been of considerable height, as he is most famously recounted for riding a rather large white horse. He is most remembered for wearing a black military uniform with shiny gold buttons and a pith hat. Although Maroons are often portrayed wearing lion cloths or ambraje, it is not uncommon for the generals to have had access to all manner of clothing, either from the spoils of war or treasure of raids. So Accompong's uniform should come as no surprise. As a boy, his father raised him to be a Maroon warrior, training in all sorts of discipline, including traditional Akan wrestling. He also learned weapons, including the yunga, which is a type of light spear for throwing in long-range combat, the afana, which is an Akan-style machete, and how to shoot the rifle and other guns that fell into Maroon possession. Accompong was skilled in martial arts, and he was also an excellent marksman. Yet his greatest assets were his often underrated skills as a military tactician and diplomat. He was also a rather compassionate man. This was illustrated after they conquered Captain Shettleford's party in 1735. He was said to favor sparing the lives of prisoners of war and became upset with his brother Quao, who favored the execution of prisoners. Accompong was born in the early days of the British taking over the island from the Spaniards. His father had been a buccaneer assaulting the Spanish. The Maroons significantly influenced the buccaneers. In fact, the term buccaneer comes from a Taino word, bucan, which refers to a wooden grill made out of a pimento tree found in Jamaica on which meat was cooked. It is also smoked with the berries of that tree, and we famously know this cooking style as Jamaican jerk. However, French pirates who frequented the Tainos and harbored many runaways adopted this form of cooking and became famous for it. And thus, during the golden age of piracy in Jamaica, the term buccaneers came about. It must be understood that although many of the Maroons were of African descent, the Tainos were the first Maroons, and they survived by mixing with Africans. When the British took the island from the Spaniards, it was with the help of a group of Maroons led by Juan de Bolas, some of them even buccaneers. After the war, however, the British sought to subjugate the other Maroons in the mountains, then use Juan de Bolas and his Maroons to kill them off. Juan would lead his Maroons, who were now by definition black shots, former slaves who worked as militiamen to bring in runaway slaves. He would lead his black shots to the mountains and killed off many of the Taino Maroons. Kojo and Accompong narrowly escaped being killed as children by Juan and his men. But Juan and his men would meet their end at the hands of another group of Maroons, who would eventually join Naquan and his Maroons. This man was known as Juan de Serras. Despite the death of Juan de Bolas, successive British governors from 1664 to 1690 would make it a priority to try and bring the Maroons in. It is for this reason that King Naquan traveled across the island often, especially to the unsettled parts of Jamaica, and this is how Accompong came to know the island so well, especially the west, where he would eventually settle. Thomas Motorford governed Jamaica from 1664 to 1671. While in office, he waged many unsuccessful wars against the Maroons. He had a personal reason to stop them, as he was also the owner of a 16-mile-long cacao plantation, which was constantly raided by the Maroons. Thomas Lynch and Henry Morgan from the 1660s to the 1680s would launch assaults on the Blue Mountains, again unsuccessfully, never quite finding the great Negro town. Captain Morgan had been a buccaneer assaulting the Spanish Main, much like his father, long before he was a governor of Jamaica. We can't say for certain if he and Accompong's father crossed paths, but he certainly knew of him. But now Morgan was a suit, and on the opposite side of the Maroons, and got smoked just like the others. John Vaughan, who governed Jamaica from 1675 to 1678, would try his luck. But he soon found he was out of it, like a duck who got plucked out of luck. It was during his tenure that the Maroons led a rebellion at Duck's Estate in 1678. Henders Molesworth became acting lieutenant governor in 1685, and the same year had to contend with a year-long war waged by the Maroons. Soon after this, Accompong and his brother would lead one of the most famous rebellions in Jamaica. In 1690, between 300 and 400 slaves belonging to Sutton's plantation in Clarendon, they killed the white men entrusted with the care of it and seized upon a large store of firearms. After burning down the estate, they proceeded to the next plantation and murdered the overseer. Over 600 people were freed in this rebellion, many of them joining the Maroons after. Before Prince Naquan passed away, he left charge of the Maroons to his sons, Kojo, Accompong, and Johnny. At this time, they were primarily located in the Great Negro Town and Cave River. After the Sutton Plantation Rebellion, they soon expanded from Cave River to move west and consolidate all the Maroon clans under one unified banner to better fight the British. On the journey west, Kojo took Accompong and Johnny with him as generals, and Kofi and Kwaku as captains under them. Queen Nanny would stay behind with Kwao and Kwashi and run the Great Negro Town, which became known as Nanny Town. Kojo would strategically set up settlements in the west and put his brothers in charge of them while he traveled across the island. Accompong was in charge of the main military base, and this encampment would eventually become Accompong Town. Although today's Accompong Town is an expansion from the original location, now known as Old Town. Accompong's military brilliance is often outshined by Kojo and Nanny, but it must be noted Accompong was never conquered, and it was the site of the final victory over the British. This is why Kojo entrusted the West to Accompong. While the West was for the most part more quiet than the East in regards to Maroon activity, there were some raids and assaults carried out by Maroons in the West. In April 1728, Ralph Rippon, a planter of St. Elizabeth, a parish neighboring Accompong, lost his slaves in a Maroon raid. In October of that same year, the Archdeacon and Pestel plantations in central Jamaica were attacked by Maroons. They freed over 26 people, men, women, and children, in addition to stealing their goods and arms. Accompong, Johnny, and Kojo favored stealth in the west, while Nanny and Kwao in the east were not as quiet as Kojo would have liked, leading to the discovery of Nanny Town. It was for this reason most of the major battles took place on the eastern side of the island, especially Nanny Town. Until the discovery of the Maroon towns in the west, much of the British efforts were concentrated on Nanny Town, or as it was called by the British, the Great Negro Town. Thus, Accompong would fight alongside his family, defending his hometown in some of the most historic battles. The Battle of the Plains, 1727. The Sappers' Invasion, 1730. Regiments from England, 1733. And the Seamen, 1734, with 400 troops. Tired of losing to the Maroons, the British sent for what they thought were more battle-hardened troops. They called on the Seamen, led by Sir Chaloner Ogle, who were stationed at Port Royal. Captain Ogle would send about 400 troops to deliver a thorough beating, but the Maroons would decimate the seamen easily. The defeat of the seamen led to widespread panic in Jamaica and the British Empire, to the point where enslaved people stopped working and temporarily took over the plantations, with threats of calling the Maroons. In 1734, Captain Shettleford led 300 troops against the Maroons. The captives from this battle, both white and black soldiers, were executed. This was the battle that caused a disagreement between Accompong and Quao. In 1735, the British sent for 600 troops from Gibraltar, and with 200 more from Jamaica, they managed to successfully occupy Nanny Town and scatter the Maroons once again. Accompong took 1/3 of the Maroon clans with him to Accompong Town. After the migration west, there were a few major battles that took place. In 1738, the British had sent for 200 Mosquito Indian trackers to help discover the location of Accompong Town. So Accompong and his brother created a mock village and lured the British and their guides into thinking they had found the village. Colonel Guthrie, thinking he had seized a town, would write about how he was now master of the town. Ultimately, when the Mosquito Indians led the British to the village, they led them right into a trap, as they would soon be met with a rain of Yunga spears forcing a retreat. In 1738, the British would launch a massive assault on 3 Maroon towns at the same time in hopes of wiping out the Maroons. They attacked Accompong, Nanny Town, and Moortown with 600 troops. They would have some success at Nanny Town, but at Accompong they were embarrassed. They had major trouble carrying the heavy guns over the hilly terrain and couldn't outmaneuver the swift and stealthy Accompong and his Maroons, and they were decimated. Moortown experienced similar results. In 1738, under the pretense of peace, the British tried to lure out the Maroons, but while passing through the cave in Accompong Town, they were ambushed. Accompong, Kojo, Johnny, and about 27 other Maroons erased from existence all 300 soldiers. This led to the official peace treaty. In 1738, in Accompong Town, the British would come to a peace treaty with the Maroons, and it is in this treaty that Accompong's name is recorded as the second colonel or chief of the Maroons after Kojo, and after him Johnny. Maroons say Kojo never signed the document, but instead the British representatives met the Maroons and performed a blood ritual that bound them to peace. Accompong's blood was in the calabash and a part of this treaty. The last detail we found about him on record is a document from the British in which he and the Maroons were gifted 2 cows, raw material, and clothing as a sign of peace. His descendants are also of the Rowe family. Like Nanny, Kojo, and Accompong, his descendants took the last name Rowe. It is said that the Rowes are also related to the Wrights, the Reeds, the Fosters, Cawley, Curry, and possibly Harris. Upon visiting the cemetery of Accompong, these names rest next to each other. Accompong is said to be buried somewhere in Cockpit country. However, his gravesite has purposefully been obscured because in the late 1800s to 1900s, apparently Oba men, sorcerers, were using his gravesite for rituals. When I went back to Jamaica for the family reunion, we marched to Kojo's grave during the festival. On my last trip, I saw a mountain area that I was unusually drawn to. I began to climb up the mountain, but out of respect, I stopped. I was later told it's the direction of his grave. Nonetheless, Accompong's legacy lives on as a country within a country. It is the capital of Cockpit country, and it stands till this day as a sovereign republic. And at the time of this recording, Chief Richard Curry is head of state. Accompong's spirit is said to still roam Accompong. He can be seen at night riding his giant white horse, wearing a black military suit with gold buttons and a pith hat. I made this video to acknowledge his contribution and honor his memory.